As you know, the SEC's mission is to protect investors in our capital markets, and requiring companies to disclose information is a critical part of that mission. Publicly traded companies may not like disclosing potentially embarrassing or damaging information, but the SEC's job is to look out for investors, not for big companies. Now, there's a lot you could be doing to protect investors. There are still 20 mandatory Dodd-Frank rules from 2010 that the SEC hasn't completed. And there are more than 1 million people, including countless investors and former SEC commissioners, pushing the agency to require publicly traded companies to disclose their political contributions. But instead of moving forward on issues intended to help investors, you've actually headed in the opposite direction. Since your first year in office, you've dedicated significant SEC time and resources to a project you invented and called the Disclosure Effectiveness Initiative. According to a 2013 speech you gave, your big idea behind this project is that the SEC might be requiring companies to disclose too much information, causing investors to suffer from something you call information overload. Now, I'm all for eliminating redundant disclosures or improving the ways that information is presented, but honestly, I have never heard of the concept of information overload in the context of investing in stocks. I've never heard of the idea that investors actually want less information that they're getting. So I have a pretty simple question. The SEC is an investor protection agency. So when you launched your project, what evidence did you have that information overload was a real problem that investors wanted you to solve?
It's an issue, Senator Warren, that the Commission has been looking at for really decades, among others. But the purpose of disclosure effectiveness, and by the way, it wasn't invented by me. It was basically in response to a congressional mandate to do a report that reviewed our entire.
I'm sorry. When was this report that you're talking about?
It was I think presented to Congress, filed with Congress at the end of 2013.
So are you, now wait, are you talking about the Jobs Act report?
Yes.
Because that one, I actually looked at that.
Yeah.
And what was asked of you was that the SEC review one subset of disclosures to see if that subset should be modified as they apply to one subset of companies, so-called emerging growth companies. Your project has gone way beyond the boundaries identified in that law.
Yeah, emerging growth companies are a very broad swath, as you know, of the markets.
I understand that, but that's not where your project is.
We've been, for decades at the SEC, is my point, undergoing disclosure effectiveness review, and I absolutely agree that there's nothing more important.
My question is, when you launched your initiative called the Information Overload, this is what you identified, and I just want to know what evidence you have that this is a real problem, that investors have come to you and said, we're worried about getting too much information. Yeah. Just what evidence did you have?
First of all, the review is not limited to duplicative or overloaded information. It's really
you mean the review in the 2012 Jobs Act?
No, our review. It's meant to make disclosure more meaningful to investors. And we've also gotten comments, I will say recently, from all kinds of constituents, including our Investor Advisory Committee, about identifying and really not objecting to removing things that are repetitive, duplicative, not useful. And the purpose of this review is to make disclosure more meaningful for investors.
I started this by saying I don't have a problem with getting rid of duplication. I don't have a problem with making it more effective. The question I asked you about is whether or not this so-called information overload is a real problem identified by investors that have come to you. Let's be honest about this. I cannot find, and you have not produced, a single investor who has complained to the SEC about receiving too much information. Investors don't want less information about the companies where they put their money. In fact, I think that's ridiculous. The SEC's own Investor Advisory Committee, which includes everyone from hedge funds to pension funds to retail investors, say that recently that the current amount of disclosure, and here was their word, is appropriate. So who wants less information to be disclosed? It's pretty clear. The National Chamber of Commerce, which represents the giant companies that have to do the disclosing. The Chamber has produced a fact-free report whining about this non-existent information overload problem in 2014, shortly after you launched your initiative. You know, information overload is a problem that was invented to justify a project aimed at making life easier for big companies and harder for investors. In fact, Keith Higgins, the SEC's head of the Corporation Finance Division and the lead on this project, kind of let the cat out of the bag in 2014 when he said in a speech the aim of this project was, quote, to reduce the burden on companies, consistent with our mission of investor protection, wherever we can. Now, I recognize that congressional Republicans slipped language into the must-pass highway bill at the end of last year that asks the SEC to review disclosures with an eye toward eliminating ones that are unnecessary. Of course, that doesn't justify the SEC dedicating resources to this project for 2 years before that, but nevertheless, given the views of your own Investor Advisory Committee that the current disclosures are appropriate, do you agree that the supposed information overload problem does not exist?
Well, I think if you go back to even Thurgood Marshall years ago in defining materiality under the federal securities laws, the concern was expressed about too much information could sort of cloud the meaningful. I think you're describing our disclosure effectiveness review in a way that's much narrower than its intent. And I think one of the most important things about a disclosure effectiveness review, and again, we're listening to everybody. We're also talking about adding information in this review that is needed to be added, for example, on foreign taxes and other things, but is also the manner in which the information is being provided to investors, given how they've, which is a huge priority of this review.
We're over our time, so let me just stop you there. I have said now 3 times, I think, in just this brief exchange, I'm fine with cutting out duplication. I'm fine with making the information clearer. And as should be clear, I'm fine with providing more information. What I'm trying to identify is something that you specifically have targeted and talked about. I am frustrated that at your direction, the SEC has voluntarily spent 2 years trying to address a problem that you have no evidence exists. Instead of making up work to help giant corporations, the SEC should do its job, starting with the 20 required rules under Dodd-Frank that still aren't fixed 6 years after the law was passed. Your job is to look out for investors, but you've put the interests of the Chamber of Commerce and their big business members at the top of your priority list. A year ago, I called your leadership at the SEC extremely disappointing. Today, I am more disappointed than ever. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I'm disappointed in your disappointment and could not disagree anymore with your characterization of what we're trying to do to improve our disclosure regime for investors, to make it better.
When you bring me evidence of this so-called information overload that you have initiated, then we can have more conversation
I would suggest reading the SK concept release for the range of issues we're addressing, including that.
Well, I'd like to see some evidence that there really is a problem here.
Senator Warner.